The day I lost my money, my family stopped calling. At least, that's what I believed at first. The truth turned out to be much uglier. I'm Eleanor Hayes, 69 years old, a widow, a mother, a grandmother, and for most of my life, the person everyone in my family seemed to rely on. For years, my phone rarely stayed quiet for more than an hour. There was always a text, a call, an invitation, or a favor. My son Brandon wanted advice. My daughter-in-law Vanessa wanted help with a school fundraiser. My grandchildren wanted spending money for field trips, baseball equipment, or birthday surprises. I never complained. I loved being needed. Then one Monday morning, everything changed. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, drinking coffee from the same blue mug I'd used for nearly 20 years when a former colleague called. His voice sounded uneasy. He asked if I was doing all right after the news. I had no idea what he was talking about. He told me a local business publication had run a story about the collapse of a company I had founded years ago. I hadn't owned the company in a long time, but my name was still associated with it. By lunchtime, the article had spread online. By evening, 3 different neighbors had mentioned it. I expected my family to call and ask how I was holding up. Instead, silence settled over my house like a heavy winter fog. Tuesday came. Nothing. Wednesday came. Nothing. My phone sat on the counter dark and motionless. No cheerful messages from my grandchildren. No quick check-ins from Brandon. No heart emojis from Vanessa. At first, I made excuses for them. People get busy. Kids have school. Adults have jobs. Life happens. That's what I told myself. But by the 3rd day, even I couldn't ignore it. The quiet felt deliberate. I walked through my house that Thursday afternoon, straightening picture frames and folding blankets that didn't need folding. The silence followed me from room to room. In the family photos lining the hallway, everyone was smiling. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. Summer barbecues. Looking at those pictures, I realized something uncomfortable. Nearly every memory attached to them involved me paying for something. Vacations. College tuition. Down payments. Emergency loans. I stopped in front of a photograph taken 5 years earlier at a lake house rental. Brandon had his arm around me. Vanessa was smiling beside him. The grandchildren were laughing on the dock. It looked like a perfect family. Yet standing there alone, I couldn't remember the last time any of them had visited without needing something. I pushed the thought away. It felt cruel. Then, just before dinner, my phone finally lit up. My heart jumped. It wasn't Brandon. It wasn't one of my grandchildren. It wasn't even a friend. It was Vanessa. For a moment, relief washed over me. I answered immediately. But the first question out of her mouth made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I needed anything. In a voice that sounded strangely cheerful, she asked, "So, Eleanor, how much did you actually lose?" For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. I stood there in my kitchen holding the phone against my ear while the refrigerator hummed quietly behind me. Vanessa laughed softly, as if she had asked an innocent question. I looked through the window above the sink. The maple tree in my backyard swayed gently in the evening breeze. Everything outside looked normal. Nothing inside felt normal anymore. "I am doing fine, Vanessa," I said carefully. "Thank you for asking." There was a brief silence. Then she cleared her throat. "Of course. I just meant the company situation. Brandon saw the article. We were worried." Worried. It was an interesting choice of words. She had not asked how I was feeling. She had not asked whether the story was accurate. She had not asked whether I needed help. She wanted numbers. She wanted damage estimates. She wanted to know what was left. I told her the company had not belonged to me for years. That technically, very little in my personal life had changed. Her enthusiasm faded immediately. Within another minute, the conversation ended. After I hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I opened my contacts and scrolled through names. Brandon, Vanessa, Tyler, Emma, my grandchildren. Looking at those names felt strangely different now. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had been difficult. Questions kept circling through my mind. I made coffee and carried my mug to the back porch. The air was cool. A robin landed near the bird feeder. Usually mornings like that made me feel grateful. That morning they made me feel alone. Around 9 o'clock, I called Brandon. It went to voicemail. I left a cheerful message. 2 hours later, no response. By lunch, still nothing. Late that afternoon, I received a text. It was only 4 words long. Busy today. Talk later. No apology. No explanation. I remembered a different Brandon. The little boy who used to sit beside me at the kitchen table coloring dinosaurs while I paid bills. The teenager who called me whenever he needed advice. The young man who cried in my arms after his first serious heartbreak. Somewhere along the way, that version of my son had disappeared. Or perhaps I had simply stopped seeing him clearly. Over the next few days, I began noticing things I had ignored before. The family group photographs posted online suddenly excluded me. Weekend plans happened without invitations. A birthday dinner for a cousin came and went. I learned about it from social media. Nobody had mentioned it. Nobody had called. I kept telling myself not to overreact. Families go through phases. People get distracted. Yet every explanation felt weaker than the one before it. On Sunday afternoon, I drove to a grocery store across town. Near the produce section, I ran into an old friend named Carol Mitchell. We had known each other for nearly 40 years. Carol took one look at my face and lowered her shopping basket. "Eleanor," she said gently, "what is going on?" I tried to smile. She did not buy it. We ended up sitting together in the store cafe with paper cups of coffee. I told her about the silence. The missed calls. The strange behavior. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, she leaned back and folded her arms. Her expression was not surprised. That unsettled me more than anything. "What?" I asked. Carol hesitated. Then she said something I could not stop thinking about. "Eleanor, are you sure they are reacting to what happened this week?" She looked directly into my eyes. "Or are you finally noticing something that has been happening for years?" Carol's question followed me home and settled into every quiet corner of my house. That evening, I heated a bowl of soup and ate alone at the kitchen table. The television was on, but I was not watching it. I kept replaying moments I had dismissed over the years. Little things. Things that had seemed harmless at the time. The next morning, I opened my photo albums. Not because I was looking for evidence. At least that is what I told myself. I was looking for memories. But memories have a strange way of revealing things when you are finally ready to see them. There was a photograph from Tyler's 10th birthday party. I had paid for the entire event at a bowling alley outside Columbus. 40 guests. Pizza. Decorations. A custom cake. Looking at the picture, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. Vanessa was smiling directly at the camera. Brandon was holding a plate of cake. Everyone looked happy. Yet I could not remember receiving a single invitation to anything after that party unless someone needed financial help. I turned another page. There was Emma's dance recital. Another page. A family vacation in Florida. Another page. Holiday dinners. Graduation parties. Anniversary celebrations. Again and again, I found myself asking the same uncomfortable question. If I had not been paying, would I have been included? Around noon, my phone buzzed. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. It was a text from Tyler. My 16-year-old grandson rarely contacted me directly. The message was simple. "Hi, Grandma. Hope you are doing okay." I smiled immediately. Then another message appeared. Mom was wondering if the newspaper story was true. My smile disappeared. I stared at the screen. Not because Tyler had done anything wrong. He was a teenager caught in the middle of adults. But the message felt revealing. Even his concerns seemed connected to the same question everyone else wanted answered. What happened to the money? I responded kindly and changed the subject. A few minutes later, he sent a thumbs up emoji and the conversation ended. That afternoon, I decided to visit a small bakery I used to love. The owner, a cheerful woman named Denise, greeted me warmly and asked where I had been. We chatted for nearly 20 minutes. She asked about my health. She asked about my garden. She asked whether I was enjoying retirement. Not once did she mention the article. Not once did she ask about finances. Driving home, I realized something that made my chest tighten. A woman who sold pastries cared more about my well-being than some members of my own family. 2 days later, another strange thing happened. Late Friday evening, my phone chimed with a notification from a family group chat. I frowned. I had not seen activity in that group for weeks. Curious, I opened it. For a brief second, dozens of messages appeared on the screen. Then they vanished. Someone had removed me almost immediately. But not before I saw enough. My hands froze. One message from Vanessa read, "Do we know how much she still has?" Another from Brandon followed. "Not sure. I am trying to find out." Then the chat disappeared completely. I sat motionless in my living room. The lamp beside my chair cast a warm yellow glow across the carpet. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, something had changed forever. Because for the first time, I was no longer wondering whether something was wrong. I knew it was. The only question left was how long it had been happening behind my back. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those messages. Not because they were cruel. In some ways, they were worse than cruel. They were practical. Clinical. The kind of messages people send when they are discussing an account balance, not a mother. The next morning, I sat at my dining room table with a yellow legal pad and began writing down memories. At first, I felt ridiculous. Then the list started growing. 3 years ago, Brandon called asking for help with a down payment on a larger house. He promised it would only be temporary. I transferred $60,000 within 2 days. 2 years ago, Vanessa wanted to start an online boutique. She presented a business plan over dinner. I invested $25,000 because she looked so excited and because family supports family. A year later, the business quietly disappeared. The money never came back. Then there were the smaller things. School tuition. Summer camps. Medical bills. Car repairs. Emergency expenses. Family vacations. I had never kept score because I never thought love was supposed to be measured that way. Yet as I filled page after page, a pattern emerged. Whenever there was a financial problem, I received phone calls immediately. Whenever there was good news, I often heard about it later from someone else. Around noon, my doorbell rang. It was Carol. She walked in carrying a paper bag filled with sandwiches and 2 cups of coffee. She took one look at the papers spread across my table and nodded. "You are doing it too, aren't you?" she asked. "Doing what?" I said. "Replaying everything." I laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" Carol sat down and glanced at the list. Her expression grew serious. "Eleanor, can I ask you something difficult?" I told her she could. She pointed at the pages. "How many times did they call just to see how you were doing?" I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Because honestly, I could not remember. Carol reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Good people do not keep score," she said. "But people who take advantage of good people count on that." After she left, I found myself thinking about Richard, my late husband. He had passed away 7 years earlier. Richard was not perfect, but he noticed things I often missed. One memory returned with surprising clarity. We had been driving home from a family barbecue when he glanced over at me and said, "Promise me something." I asked what he meant. He smiled and kept his eyes on the road. If there ever comes a day when people only show up because they want something, do not confuse their presence with love. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now his words felt like a warning sent across the years. Later that evening, I decided to check something. I opened social media and searched through recent family posts. What I found made my stomach tighten. During the same week, nobody had time to call me. There had been dinners, outings, birthday celebrations, and weekend gatherings. Everyone seemed available. Everyone seemed connected. Everyone seemed busy with each other. Just not with me. Then I noticed a comment under one photograph. It was from Brandon. Only 6 words. Yet those 6 words stopped me cold. Hopefully things work out soon. The comment was posted beneath a conversation about my finances. That comment stayed with me all weekend. Not because it was dramatic, but because it confirmed something I had been trying not to believe. Brandon already knew far more about my financial situation than he should have. The question was how. Monday morning brought an answer I never expected. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local bank branch where I had maintained accounts for years. I assumed it was a routine matter. Instead, the manager asked if I had recently authorized someone to inquire about several of my financial holdings. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. I told him absolutely not. The manager apologized and explained that no confidential information had been released. However, someone claiming to be helping with my estate planning had attempted to verify details regarding certain assets. My pulse quickened. Did they give a name? I asked. There was a pause. The manager hesitated before answering. I probably should not discuss specifics, Mrs. Hayes. But I thought the inquiry seemed unusual. That is why I called. His careful tone told me everything I needed to know. After we ended the call, I sat motionless in my home office. Sunlight streamed through the window and landed across the framed photographs on my desk. One showed Brandon holding a fishing rod when he was 12 years old. Another showed him graduating from college. Looking at those pictures hurt in a way I could not describe. Not because of what he had done. Because of how easily I could imagine him doing it. Later that afternoon, I met Carol for coffee. We sat near the window of a small cafe downtown. The place smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. Normally it would have felt comforting. Instead, I found myself staring into my coffee while telling her about the call from the bank. Carol listened carefully. When I finished, she sighed. Eleanor, I think you need to stop asking whether something is wrong. What do you mean? I asked. I think you need to start asking how long it has been wrong. Her words settled heavily between us. On the drive home, I decided to do something I should have done years ago. I called Richard Coleman. Richard had been my attorney for nearly 2 decades. He had also been one of Richard's closest friends before my husband passed away. If anyone knew the full picture of my estate, it was him. Richard answered on the second ring. After a brief conversation, he invited me to his office the following morning. There are a few things we should discuss in person, he said. The seriousness in his voice immediately caught my attention. The next day, I arrived at his office shortly before 10. After exchanging greetings, he opened a file cabinet and removed a thick folder bearing my name. Then he looked directly at me. Before we begin, he said carefully, I need to ask whether Brandon has been contacting anyone regarding your trusts. The room suddenly felt smaller. I stared at him across the desk. Why would you ask that? Richard slowly folded his hands. Because this is not the first time someone has been trying to find out exactly what you are worth. Richard held my gaze for several seconds before opening the folder. The office was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Outside his window, downtown Columbus moved through another ordinary morning. Inside that room, my understanding of the last few years was beginning to unravel. How many times? I asked quietly. Richard looked down at the documents. 3 that I know about. I felt my stomach tighten. 3 times Brandon contacted you? Richard nodded. Not directly asking for money, Not directly asking for access. He was more careful than that. He asked questions. Hypothetical questions. Questions about estate planning. Questions about trusts. Questions about what would happen if you became unable to manage your affairs. For a moment, I could not speak. I remembered every holiday. Dinner. Every birthday gathering. Every cheerful phone call. Suddenly, they felt different. As though another conversation had been happening behind the one I could hear. Richard slid a page across the desk. I did not answer anything confidential. But I documented the inquiries because they seemed unusual. I glanced at the notes. The earliest entry was nearly 2 years old. 2 years. The realization landed heavily. This had started long before the newspaper article. Long before the company story. Long before the silence. The silence was not the beginning. It was simply the first time I noticed. Why did you not tell me? I asked. Richard leaned back. Because at first, I hoped it was harmless curiosity. Parents age. Children ask questions. It happens. But then the questions became more specific. He paused. And frankly, Eleanor, your husband anticipated something like this. My head lifted immediately. Richard? He opened another section of the folder. A few months before he passed away, he added instructions regarding several family trusts. Hearing my husband's name still carried a strange weight even after 7 years. Richard continued carefully. Your husband loved Brandon. But he worried that money might one day influence certain decisions. I stared at him. He never told me that. Richard gave a sad smile. He hoped he was wrong. On the drive home, I barely turned on the radio. My thoughts were too loud. I kept replaying old conversations. Family vacations where financial topics somehow appeared. Casual questions about property values. Remarks about retirement accounts. Comments that had seemed innocent at the time. One memory surfaced with startling clarity. About 18 months earlier, Vanessa had asked whether maintaining such a large house was becoming difficult for me. I remembered laughing and saying I was perfectly capable of taking care of it. At the time, she smiled and changed the subject. Now I wondered why she had asked in the first place. That evening, I opened a storage box in my closet containing old letters and paperwork. I was not looking for anything specific. I simply needed to feel grounded. As I sorted through the documents, I found a birthday card from Richard written shortly before his final illness. Inside was a handwritten note. The message was simple. You always see the best in people. Never lose that. Just remember that seeing the best does not mean ignoring the truth. I sat there holding the card long after sunset. Then my phone vibrated. A message from Brandon appeared on the screen. After nearly 2 weeks of distance, he suddenly wanted to meet for lunch. He added a smiling emoji and wrote that he missed me. I read the message twice. Then 3 times. For the first time, instead of feeling relieved, I found myself wondering what had changed. I did not answer Brandon's message right away. That alone was unusual. For years, whenever my son called or texted, I responded almost immediately. This time, I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and walked away. I spent the rest of the evening watering flowers on my back patio and thinking. Not about what Brandon wanted. About timing. People reveal themselves through timing. They show up when they need comfort. They show up when they need help. They show up when they need money. The question was which version of Brandon I was about to see. The next morning, I finally replied and agreed to lunch. He suggested a restaurant near his office. The same restaurant where we used to meet on birthdays and special occasions. When I arrived, Brandon was already seated. He stood and hugged me warmly. Too warmly. For a moment, I almost doubted everything. Almost. Then I sat down and noticed he kept studying my face. Watching me. Measuring my mood. The waiter brought water. We ordered sandwiches. Small talk filled the first few minutes. The weather. Traffic. The grandchildren. It felt rehearsed. Finally, Brandon leaned forward. Mom, I have been worried about you. I nodded. That is kind of you. He smiled. The article surprised everyone. There it was. Not concern for me. Concern for the article. I asked what exactly had surprised him. He hesitated. Just for a second. Well, the business situation. Nobody expected it. I stirred my iced tea slowly. I have not owned that company for years. Brandon forced a laugh. Right. Of course. Then he changed direction. Have you thought about simplifying things? Simplifying what? I asked. The house. The investments. All the responsibilities. His voice sounded casual. Too casual. Suddenly I remembered the notes Richard had shown me. The questions about trusts. The questions about incapacity. The questions about control. This conversation was not spontaneous. It was part of a much longer one. I smiled politely and changed the subject. The disappointment that flashed across Brandon's face lasted less than a second. But I saw it. After lunch, he insisted on paying the bill. Another unusual detail. When we walked into the parking lot, he gave me another hug and told me to call if I needed anything. I drove home feeling strangely calm. Because for the first time, I stopped wondering whether my suspicions were unfair. They were not. Later that afternoon, Richard called. He had spent the morning reviewing several documents connected to my estate planning. Eleanor, he said carefully, I think we should test something. I listened as he explained an idea. A harmless piece of information. A rumor, really. Something believable. Something that would travel quickly through the family if the people asking questions were motivated by money. When he finished, I stared out the window at my backyard. The plan was simple. We would quietly let it be known that an old investment connected to my former company might generate an unexpected payout worth several $1 million. Then we would wait. Richard was silent for a moment. If their behavior changes overnight, he said, you will finally have your answer. The rumor began moving faster than I expected. Richard made a single phone call to an accountant who had worked with my former company years earlier. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be traced back to me. Just enough information to suggest that an old investment dispute might be ending in my favor. Then we waited. We did not have to wait long. Less than 48 hours later, my phone rang at 8:15 on a Saturday morning. It was Vanessa. I almost laughed. For 2 weeks, she had barely acknowledged my existence. Suddenly she wanted to know how I was doing. Her voice sounded warm. Concerned. Affectionate. She asked about my garden. My health. My sleep. She even asked whether I needed help around the house. I answered politely and listened. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. Not once did she mention money. That was almost impressive. After we hung up, I made a note of the time in a small notebook. 3 hours later, Brandon called. Then Emma texted. Then Tyler sent a message asking if I wanted to attend one of his baseball games the following week. By Sunday evening, I had heard from more family members than I had during the previous month combined. The timing was impossible to ignore. On Monday, flowers arrived at my front door. A large arrangement of yellow roses with a card signed by Brandon and Vanessa. The message read, "Thinking about you." I stared at the card for a long time. Then I placed it on the kitchen counter beside the notebook where I had been recording everything. Tuesday brought another surprise. Vanessa invited me to dinner. Not a holiday. Not a birthday. Not a special occasion. Just dinner. Apparently they missed me. Apparently they wanted more family time. Apparently they had been worried. The explanations came so quickly they almost tripped over one another. I accepted the invitation. Not because I believed them. Because I wanted to observe. When I arrived at their house that evening, the atmosphere felt different. Brandon greeted me at the door as though I were a celebrity. Vanessa had prepared my favorite meal. The grandchildren were unusually attentive. Tyler carried my purse inside. Emma complimented my sweater 3 separate times. It would have been touching if it had not felt so carefully coordinated. During dinner, the conversation drifted through harmless topics. School, sports, weather, television shows. Then Brandon casually asked whether I had spoken to anyone from my old company recently. I nearly smiled. There it was. The first probe. I answered vaguely and took another bite of chicken. A few minutes later, Vanessa mentioned how unpredictable investments could be. Another probe. Later, Emma asked whether I planned to travel anytime soon if everything worked out. She looked genuinely confused when she said it, as though she had overheard something without fully understanding it. Children often reveal what adults try to hide. By the time dessert arrived, I no longer had doubts. I had confirmation. Not proof. Not yet. But confirmation. As I drove home that night, my phone buzzed with a new text from Brandon. It was so great seeing you, Mom. We should do this more often. I looked at the message while sitting in my driveway. Then I glanced at the notebook resting on the passenger seat. For the first time, the pattern was impossible to miss. And for the first time, I realized just how predictable they had become. Over the next 10 days, the attention intensified. It was almost fascinating to watch. Brandon called every morning. Not every week. Not every few days. Every morning. Vanessa began sending photographs of family activities with captions about how much everyone missed me. Emma suddenly wanted baking lessons. Tyler asked if I would like to attend another game. Invitations appeared from nowhere. Family dinners. Weekend outings. Movie nights. It felt as if someone had flipped a switch. The more they heard whispers about my supposed financial recovery, the more available they became. I kept my responses warm but measured. I accepted some invitations and declined others. Mostly I watched. One afternoon, I stopped by a bookstore and unexpectedly saw Vanessa sitting at a table in the cafe section with a woman I recognized from one of her social circles. They did not see me. I was about to walk away when I heard my name. Instinctively, I paused near a display of cookbooks. If everything goes through, they say it could be millions, Vanessa said quietly. My chest tightened. Her friend raised her eyebrows. Seriously? Vanessa nodded. That is what Brandon thinks. We are just trying to stay close and be supportive right now. Supportive. The word almost made me laugh. I left before hearing anything else. I did not need to. That single sentence told me more than an hour of explanations ever could. Later that evening, I wrote every detail in my notebook. The pages were becoming a timeline of revelations. Dates. Conversations. Messages. Behavioral changes. Evidence not of criminal wrongdoing, but of something that hurt far more. Conditional love. The following weekend, Brandon invited me to a barbecue at his house. Nearly the entire family attended. The atmosphere felt strangely cheerful. People who had ignored me weeks earlier now competed for my attention. One cousin offered to help maintain my property. Another asked whether I had considered taking a luxury vacation. Vanessa hovered nearby all afternoon with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Then came the moment that changed everything. As the sun began setting, I stepped inside to get a glass of water. Voices drifted from the hallway near Brandon's office. I recognized Brandon immediately. Vanessa was with him. Neither realized I was nearby. Do not push too hard, Brandon whispered. If she thinks we only care because of the money, it will ruin everything. Vanessa sighed impatiently. Then tell your mother something. We need to know what is actually happening. Silence followed. Then Brandon spoke again. Once we know the size of the payout, we can figure out the rest. I stood perfectly still. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. Somewhere outside, children laughed in the backyard. Yet all I could hear were those words. We can figure out the rest. Not concern. Not family. Not love. A strategy. A calculation. A plan. I quietly returned to the patio carrying my glass of water and sat through the rest of the evening with a calm smile on my face. Nobody seemed to notice anything different. But driving home later that night, I finally understood something important. The test was over. I no longer needed to discover who they were. Now I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. The morning after the barbecue, I called Richard and asked him to come by the house. We sat in my sunroom overlooking the backyard where Richard and I had spent countless weekends gardening together. The roses were blooming. The bird feeder was busy. Everything looked peaceful. That made the conversation feel even heavier. I told him exactly what I had overheard between Brandon and Vanessa. Richard listened carefully, without interrupting. When I finished, he slowly nodded. There was no surprise on his face. Only disappointment. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I looked out the window for a long moment. 2 months earlier, I would have answered differently. 2 months earlier, I would have looked for excuses. I would have convinced myself there was a misunderstanding. I would have protected everyone from consequences. But something inside me had changed. "I want the truth where everyone can see it," I said. Richard smiled faintly. "Then let us give them an opportunity to reveal themselves." Over the next week, we prepared carefully. Richard suggested hosting a family gathering at my house. Nothing unusual. Nothing dramatic. A simple celebration. We would tell everyone that new information regarding the investment situation had finally arrived. The invitation went out on Monday. By Tuesday, every single person had accepted. Every single person. The same people who had struggled to find time for a phone call only weeks earlier suddenly rearranged schedules, canceled plans, and promised to attend. Their enthusiasm told me more than any explanation ever could. As the weekend approached, the attention intensified again. Brandon called twice in one day. Vanessa dropped off homemade cookies. Emma asked if she could spend more time with me during summer vacation. Tyler wanted to know whether I would attend all of his remaining baseball games. I remained pleasant, warm, grateful. I never argued. I never accused. The less I pushed, the more comfortable they became. Saturday finally arrived. I spent the morning preparing food and setting tables. The house looked beautiful. Family photographs lined the walls. Fresh flowers sat on every surface. Anyone walking through the front door would have seen a home built on decades of love and sacrifice. By late afternoon, guests began arriving. Laughter filled the rooms. Conversations flowed easily. Brandon greeted relatives with unusual confidence. Vanessa seemed almost radiant. More than once, I caught them exchanging quick glances whenever someone mentioned investments or business. They were trying very hard not to look interested. Around 6 o'clock, everyone gathered in the dining room. The atmosphere felt expectant. Anticipatory. Like people waiting for a winning lottery number to be announced. I stood at the head of the table and thanked everyone for coming. Smiles appeared around the room. Glasses were raised. Then Brandon spoke. "Mom, before dinner starts, we all just want you to know how happy we are that things seem to be turning around." Several people nodded immediately. Too quickly. Too eagerly. I smiled and thanked him. Then I looked toward the doorway. Right on cue, Richard stepped into the room carrying a leather folder. The smiles remained. The confidence remained. Nobody looked worried. Not yet. Because everyone in that room believed they knew exactly what was about to happen. And they could not have been more wrong. Richard placed the folder on the dining room table and calmly took a seat beside me. Around us, conversations faded into silence. I could feel the anticipation in the room. Brandon looked relaxed. Vanessa looked confident. Several relatives exchanged curious smiles. They all believed they were about to hear good news. Richard opened the folder and adjusted his glasses. Then he began speaking. "Before discussing any financial matters, Eleanor asked me to review a series of events that occurred over the past several weeks." The room immediately became still. I watched Brandon's expression change ever so slightly. Richard continued. He spoke carefully, methodically, like a man presenting facts rather than accusations. He described the sudden disappearance of phone calls after the newspaper article appeared. He described the unusual inquiries made regarding my finances and estate planning. He described the abrupt return of attention after rumors of a potential payout began circulating. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody smiled anymore. Then Richard removed several printed pages from the folder. Copies of messages. Notes documenting conversations. Timelines showing exactly when family contact had stopped and when it had suddenly resumed. I noticed Vanessa sitting straighter in her chair. Brandon's jaw tightened. The room felt smaller with every passing minute. "This is not about money," Richard said. "It is about intent." The words landed heavily. A cousin near the far end of the table looked down at his plate. Emma appeared confused. Tyler stared quietly at his father. Richard then described how the rumor had been intentionally introduced to test whether behavior would change. A murmur spread across the room. Several relatives looked genuinely shocked. Others looked embarrassed. Brandon finally spoke. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Mom knows we care about her." His voice sounded less confident than before. Richard did not argue. Instead, he calmly read a statement documented after a conversation overheard at the barbecue. The exact words. "We need to know what is actually happening. Once we know the size of the payout, we can figure out the rest." Silence followed. Deep silence. The kind that cannot be filled with excuses. Vanessa opened her mouth as if she wanted to respond. Then she closed it again. For the first time all evening, neither of them seemed to know what to say. I looked around the room. Faces I had loved for decades avoided my eyes. Some appeared ashamed. Others appeared uncomfortable simply because they had been caught witnessing the truth. Finally, I stood. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. "I did not invite everyone here to humiliate anyone," I said. "I invited you because I spent weeks wondering whether I was imagining things. I needed to know if the love I felt from this family was real." Nobody answered. "Now I know." I looked directly at Brandon. Then at Vanessa. Neither could meet my gaze. The disappointment I felt was no longer sharp. It was quiet. Clear. Final. Richard slowly closed the folder. The sound echoed through the silent room. Then he looked at me and asked the question we had planned in advance. "Eleanor, would you like me to explain what actually happened with your assets?" Every face in the room turned toward me. And for the first time that evening, I saw genuine fear.